Hey, CowTipper Vern here. I've mentioned recently on this channel and in some other places on some interviews I've done and some projects I've been a part of with other podcasts and things about my faith deconstruction having a few different steps, starting with a reluctant deconstruction of my own 2x2 faith, transitioning that into looking to other churches and listening in on them and seeing how the worldly churches work, learning what Christian theologians and thought leaders and influencers were thinking, and finally learning about the Bible. And I've done a whole episode on the most interesting things I learned about the Bible, or at least the most interesting things that I learned that Bible scholars believe about the Bible, even though some of those things have been changing over time and people's ideas change about them and stuff like that. I've kind of skimmed past one of those subtopics in my deconstruction, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that right now. And that is my foray into apologetics, or maybe not my own foray into them, but maybe I should say not necessarily my own exploration of apologetics, but listening to them, seeking them out, finding who I thought were thought leaders in the Christian evangelical Protestant space, and my impressions of them and how they've affected how I view belief now. By definition, those were worldly things when I was a 2x2, so I didn't really get into it, and I thought maybe it was just more confusing than anything. Which is interesting. This feels like a theme in my deconstruction, is finding out that there's a lot of things I just left alone, left on the table, and didn't want to look at because I was afraid of getting confused. And all of those things involved learning things. Learning about the Bible, learning about theology, things like that. I'm going to talk about apologetics today and my impressions of popular apologetics broadly, not necessarily individual points. This isn't going to be an episode about theology at all. It's just going to be my impressions of the apologetic space as an outsider, ostensibly, a person who, to be honest, was seeking at the time. When I left the 2x2 belief system, even before I officially left, even before I talked to anybody about it, I was looking into churches and I just wasn't vibing with the churches. And maybe that's an episode in and of itself too, but I wasn't vibing with any of the churches. I didn't get it. I didn't feel like it was for me. It didn't feel that different than meetings in the sense that it was extremely different in presentation, but I didn't feel that spiritually it was any different. And that's going to sound weird because it's like the 2x2s are extremely weird with their belief system. Their own theology is extremely underdeveloped maybe, really not analyzed at all. It doesn't really exist. It's just kind of a performative thing. They do certain things, they dress a certain way, they talk a certain way, they read a certain Bible, and they have a method of preaching, and that's it. There's no belief system kind of behind it, really. That's why I talk about culture a lot, because I think it's a culture-led group. It's not really a belief-led group. The beliefs are there. Everyone believes in God. I truly believe that. I mean, I did. I believed the same thing that they did, roughly, I think. But the backing assumptions to hold up those beliefs were pretty underdeveloped because they just weren't thought about. I didn't think about them much. I didn't allow those things to be developed because to do so would be to allow an incursion of outside thought, potentially. And that was always wrong. So we didn't do it. We didn't do that type of thing. And of course, I've talked about how that led to even myself and my own wife having disagreements about what we believe the Bible said because we didn't talk about it. When your theology is distilled down into a 30-second testimony once a week or twice a week, you don't really develop your beliefs any more than that. So when I started looking outside of the 2x2, started looking outside of meetings and listening to worldly churches, as it were, to listen to what other people thought, I thought, for some reason, I had this idea in my head that they were probably doing it better because they weren't held down by the system that is the 2x2s, the workers and the conventions and everything else. The form of it. The form is so important to professing people. And while they look down on people who have church buildings because that's too concrete and that's too whatever, they themselves hold themselves to a very tight form, a very specific form. And they kind of worship that form, in my opinion. I mean, that's, maybe they wouldn't say that, but that's my impression. So I thought, well, if I step outside of that, I'll look into churches. And now that they don't have to deal with all that, they don't have to formulate their testimony or their sermon or whatever, their conversion stories, et cetera, now that they don't have to squeeze that into a mold of buns, skirts, conventions, and stew, then maybe that's freeing for them. Maybe they can talk a little bit more about their beliefs. And I felt a little bit underwhelmed by it, to be completely honest. I wasn't really into it. And I guess I realized what I was looking for was more detail to my beliefs, a little more articulation. And I wanted to hear how people sold their beliefs. 2x2s have workers that are supposed to go spread the gospel, and they go, but they don't spread the gospel. Not really. A very common thing you hear from ex-workers is that they don't actually spread the gospel. And at least in the United States, the phrase evangelicalism or evangelical church or evangelical Christians implies evangelism. It implies that the word is being spread. And I guess I was kind of intrigued by that idea. I was intrigued by the idea of, well, how do other people spread their beliefs? How do they lead other people to Christ or to God? So while I was watching the churches, I was just seeing them regurgitate their own thing and sing their own praise songs a little differently. And the form looked different for sure. And the messages were different in a lot of ways too, grace, Trinity, whatever. But it wasn't gripping me like I thought it would. And so I decided to look for something more specific. I wanted to look for people who were viewed as influential as theologians in the evangelical space, in Protestant Christianity. I also wanted to square something in my mind that I've talked about, but I haven't really added any depth to in any of the interviews I've done or on this channel either, because I haven't been able to exactly articulate it. And I've even said as much as, I don't know how this worked. And I want to square that a little bit too. And that is that I grew up in a family and in a community that was not anti-education. I grew up knowing that I would go to college someday. I have a degree that's science-based. I have a bachelor's in science. I was around educated people. Often you hear of 2x2s talking about how their belief system and the theology that they had was incongruent with learning and science and education and stuff like that. And I think that's still true. There's still a lot of anti-learning that goes on and a lot of conspiracy theory type people and a lot of that, a lot of anti-education, a lot of doubting of expertise, a lot of anti-intellectualism that I've talked about. I'm disappointed to see a lot of that in the Christian community broadly too. And I'm not sure what to do with that. Well, I am sure what I'm going to do with it, but I was exploring that as well. So there's a couple things here. First of all, I wanted to hear how the broader Christian world viewed their own beliefs. And I also wanted to see how it could square with creation. I've thought back on this quite a bit, and I think one of the ways I was able to make all of it work in my mind was as follows. I believed that science was just the uncovering of creation on some level, that whatever I see in the world around me, I have to believe that. We get back into the whole faith thing of where I thought I have to believe what I see, and I can have faith for the rest. I can have faith for things I can't see. And of course, I've talked a lot about how my first deconstruction was realizing, or my first conscious deconstruction, I should say, was when I realized that that wasn't true for a lot of people, that they started with the Bible and projected their faith from there. So if what they saw in the real world didn't match what they thought they saw in the Bible, they would believe the Bible over what they saw. And that didn't make any sense to me. So I did it the other way around. I would believe what I could see. And if the Bible didn't exactly agree with that, I would just assume that maybe the Bible had more to give on that. Maybe my understanding wasn't fully there. And I was okay with that. It's like, well, I'll just have faith. If the Bible says that the earth is a certain number of years old, that doesn't matter because it's not. It's not, that's not real. Did the Noah flood really happen? Well, I don't know. Maybe something happened that looked like a flood, and maybe they wrote about it, but that doesn't matter. What really happened matters, and what the Bible says also matters, but I allowed the edges of both of those conversations to be blurred when it was convenient for me. And when I realized how dysfunctional that was when it came to things like COVID and things like that, things that started my original conscious deconstruction, I had to look at that again. I had to reanalyze that. Growing up, I believed science mattered. And I would stop well short of saying I believe science, because that's not a thing. You don't believe science. Science is a tool. I don't believe hammers. I just use a hammer. Or when someone else uses a hammer, I appreciate what they did with it. It doesn't matter if I believe hammer or not, right? Science is a tool and science is a method and it's a whatever. I'm not going to defend science. That's stupid. If you don't believe science, that's on you, I guess. I don't really care. I'm not sure why you're listening to this. But the point is, the way I was able to make science and learning and all that stuff coexist in my head is because I believed that science was one of the ways that God spoke, or not so much that he spoke, but one of the ways that we uncovered how God had spoken. If God created everything, then science was one of our ways of understanding that. If we use scientific knowledge or scientific tools to uncover creation and understand it better, then that's one way to learn about God, learn about creation itself. Creation should point to God. And when that thing came up against the Bible, I didn't allow the Bible to supersede science in those cases because that didn't make any sense to me. I just felt like, well, I'm going to have to reinterpret the Bible a little bit. And that's fine. I'll have faith for that. That's okay. I appreciated creation because it was created by God. I called it creation, A lot of people talk about the world as creation, and I think that's cool. And baked into all those assumptions of how I believed things, I guess you could call that part of my theology. Baked into that theology is the idea that you have to accept the natural world for what it is. And if science uncovers something and describes it as best it can, maybe it's not accurate, maybe it's not perfect, but it's observing something, and I have to account for that in some way. And so that was okay. So based on that theological framework that I had, which may have just been special to me, may have just been specific to me personally, I'm not sure. But based on that framework, theology is a separate thing in one way, that theology is a way of describing God and describing the heart of God and the idea of God and how God speaks in a different way, in more of a meta way, in a metaphysical way, maybe even in a spiritual way, faith-based, etc., etc. I believed that the faith part of my faith, the faith part of my theology, such as it is, although I never would have called it a theology, the faith part of it had to be one of two things. It had to be either completely separate from the scientific part, like left brain, right brain type of thing. I know that's not accurate, but I like using that phrase because people seem to know what it means. So theology either had to be completely separate from the science part, or it needed to honor the science. So if your theology bumped up against science and science showed you something, described the world in a way, or diagnosed something you saw in front of you as being a certain thing, your theology can't just say, no, it's not. It needs to either adjust to accept that or admit that it doesn't have any purview in that case. So that's the framework I started with. And that's why when I left the 2x2s and started listening to churches, I enjoyed them, but I didn't feel like it was developing faith at all. It was just mimicking back to the audience what the audience wanted to hear. And that's why I thought, well, this is a good opportunity then. This is an opportunity for me to look into theology and belief and stuff like that and listen to people who have spent their lives studying the Bible, learning about the Bible, and see what they have to say. See how they build their own faith. How do people who spend their entire lives as theologians or thought leaders, at least within the Christian community, how do they do it? How do they speak to it? And in an evangelical sense, how do they speak to the audience? How do they convert? Do they convert? Is that interesting to them? Is it an important part of their life to bring people to Jesus, to bring people to God? How do they do that? So that's what I'm going to talk about today. When I found myself parsing out the rationale, the rational part of belief versus the meaning-making part of belief, I found those to be two separate things, but also needed to honor each other. You could make meaning. I was fine with making spiritual meaning through faith, but it had to honor the rational part of your brain too. As long as the rational part of your brain could allow for the unknown, could allow for, well, this is turning into God of the gaps, isn't it? That's essentially what I'm saying. And I see that now, but I didn't really think of it as at the time. And I have to be honest, I'm still okay with God of the gaps type thinking. I know people make fun of it. I think a lot of atheists make fun of God of the gaps thinking. I kind of get it. I think that we need that part of our brain. That's a little side topic, but I think that God of the gaps or faith of the gaps implies gaps. And I think that's okay. I think it's okay to say, I don't actually know everything. And how I fill that space can be whatever. As long as I'm not hurting somebody else with it, you can believe whatever. So anyway, that's a side topic. But anyway, wow, another long intro. Sorry about that. Today I'm going to talk about my impressions of apologetics. When I talk about apologetics, I don't actually know if I'm using the word right. I listened to a lot of churches, like I mentioned, and was pretty unsatisfied with what I was watching, not because I didn't like what they were saying, although that's true, I did not like what a lot of them were saying. But I also wanted to dip my toe into areas where people were making really thoughtful critiques of the Bible and studying it deeply and understanding it or trying to understand it, I should say, adding meaning to it. The people who were taking the Bible and getting meaning from it, not just church on Sunday kind of, music and feeling good vibes and stuff. That's fine. But I also wanted to listen to people who were putting an effort into the theology part. I looked in a very narrow slice of belief. I'll admit that right up front. I didn't look into orthodoxy. I didn't look into a lot of ancient stuff. I looked pretty much into Christian, Protestant, evangelical, because it's just the next thing. It's the next step away from 2x2s. And maybe it's the fact that I didn't get very far with any of this. Maybe I'm speeding right to the end on this to say that that's as far as I got. I didn't get any farther. But I'm going to talk about apologetics today. And when I say apologetics, I mean a couple different types of people. There's a handful of old men, usually, always men, actually, usually old, always men, who like to tell you what the Bible says. They're fairly popular in Christian culture right now. They don't really say apologist necessarily, although sometimes they'll use that word, but they usually just tape their sermons, and so they're on YouTube and stuff. So a lot of this is YouTube based, to be completely honest with you. I watched a lot of these old guys who are considered serious teachers of the Bible and go to conventions every year to teach each other how to teach the Bible and have communities of other preachers like them who talk about the Bible and work on the apologetics part of it, that they dedicate their life to speaking about the Bible and spreading the message, stuff like that. Essentially, giving their life over to it. And I wanted to listen to them talk. I wanted to listen to their version of Bible. The workers have done the same thing. The workers give up their life and go into preaching the Bible their whole life. And so I was like, well, what's the Christian Protestant version of that? And again, I'm not going to use any names because I don't think it's important here. I'll just say that they're popular people. They have big followings, and I see a lot of 2x2s gravitate to their stuff when they leave. Ex-2x2s, I should say. When people leave meetings, they often gravitate to these types of people as the stars in this field of teaching the Bible, teaching Scripture, teaching God's Word, God's law, etc., etc. So I just listened to them. I just listened to them talk on their own terms. And so that's part of it. The other part of the apologetic culture I paid attention to was the younger guys. There's a lot of younger people. And when I say younger, I'm saying my own age, probably like late 30s, early 40s, maybe late Gen X to early millennial, who are essentially influencers, I would say. They're doing the same thing as the older guys, but they're very aware they're on camera. There's guys with YouTube shows, there's guys who debate, there's guys who put all their sermons up online, put them in podcasts and stuff like that. And they're not just teaching the audience like the older guys do. The older guys like to just teach the audience in the room. The younger guys are a little bit more aware of an audience and aware that there might be some non-believers or whatever. They realize that what they're doing online is kind of debate bro culture, and they're just aware that people will hear it and people will listen to it and pick it apart, and there might be people who don't agree with them. So they're talking to a broader audience, I think, a little bit. So I spent some time just listening to those groups of people, listening to them talk, watching their shows, listening to their podcasts, things like that. I'm going to skip to the end on this one thing. I was really annoyed with it, and I was really put off by all of it. And it's part of what's led me away from calling myself a Christian, is just listening to these guys on their own terms. And I'm not talking listening to people debunk them. That's not it. I don't really care about that. Listening to these guys talk on their own terms has really put me off of the current modern Protestant Christian evangelical people in America, in the United States. I don't like what I've heard, and I'm going to talk about that today. So it's going to sound like I'm being a jerk about it, but actually I do have a point. If you're a believer and you're listening to the CowTipper Vern channel, first of all, good for you. I know that's probably not always easy to do, but I appreciate it. I appreciate that you listen. And maybe when you hear what I say today, it'll give a little bit of a window into what seekers are looking for. I was a seeker When I left meeting, I was looking for someplace else to anchor. I was looking for someplace else to put my belief, and another way to display my belief, and another place to develop community around my belief on some level. But I needed to develop my belief a little bit, and that's why I leaned into this apologetic culture stuff. And I was so disgusted and turned off by what I saw, I realized that my belief just isn't there like that anymore. And so maybe if you're a believer listening to this, maybe I can articulate why this culture is so off-putting to people who are genuinely seeking and genuinely want to learn and want to view the Bible a different way, want to learn about the Bible, want to learn about God, and want to have fellowship around it. Maybe that'll be helpful. First off, I should say that my initial impression, my very first impression of the Christian apologetic community is that they're not speaking to seekers at all. They weren't speaking to me. I have a hard time even articulating that very well, so I think the rest of the episode is going to have that as sort of the background point. I don't have that as a category to talk about today. I just want to state that right up front, that it was obvious to me, very obvious right up front, that evangelical Christians in the United States, their thought leaders, their speakers, their apologists, are not speaking to seekers at all. They're speaking to themselves, except for in ways that they can parlay other views into it. And I'm going to talk about that as I go. So I'm not going to explain that anymore. I just want to put that out front, that I did not feel spoken to at all. I didn't feel like I was the intended audience. I was seeking. I was looking for something new. And I could tell right away that they weren't talking to me at all. So maybe if you're a believer and listening to this, maybe I can articulate why that is. And maybe that'll sharpen your belief system itself, or maybe it'll help you understand how to speak to people who aren't believing or who maybe are transitioning in their faith and need to be reached. Maybe this will be helpful for you. There's 3 different categories of things that bothered me. I was writing down some notes of things that kind of annoyed me when I was listening to people that I kind of assumed were apologists or theologians or even just Christian influencers. And all of it distilled into they're not speaking to me, but it was more complex than that. So there's 3 different categories of thing. 3 different categories of thing that bothered me. 3 different subgenres of problem I had with them. The first category is gatekeeping. Second category is stagecraft. And the third category is making stuff up. I'm going to talk about each of those 3 categories right now. All right. Category 1, gatekeeping. I was alarmed when I started listening to apologists and influencers and thought leaders within the Christian community, the broader church. I was sort of surprised by how much gatekeeping there is. I mentioned that I felt like they weren't talking to me. I don't think they were really talking to anybody but themselves. And not only that, they were pulling the ladder up behind themselves. It felt to me pretty obvious they weren't really trying to spread the word necessarily. They were trying to create a culture to assimilate to what they were already saying and already believed. And there wasn't a lot of actual exploration of the Word of God, so to speak, no exploration of the Bible. They tried to make it look like that's what they were doing, but it felt like they were really just gatekeeping around their current idea. This might be another subtopic, but I was really alarmed at how little discussion of the Bible there was. When they teach, they're not teaching to explore, they're teaching to think like them. They already know. And if you don't agree, that's your problem. It's very workery, to be honest. One of the ways they do that is through language. And I'm really sensitive to this because 2x2 language is so frustrating. It's so, what's the word I'm looking for? Manipulative is an easy word here, but it's not quite that because it's not manipulative with intent necessarily, but manipulative. It's designed to nudge you in a certain way and give you a bad feeling when you go one direction, give you a good feeling when you're going another direction, and then call that all fellowship. A lot of that happens in Christian apologetics as well. I've talked a lot about the Bible. I did a whole episode on things I learned about the Bible. And part of the reason I did that is because so many people talked Bible in the Christian community, but I felt like they skimmed across it a lot and then did this. And this drives me crazy. It's the language thing. They would often use words like hermeneutics and exegesis and all this stuff, all these academic sounding terms to describe how they were reading the Bible, as if using those terms meant that the way they were reading the Bible gave them the correct answer. If anything, I find that the more I learn about the Bible, the more I think it's deep and interesting, but not univocal, not unilateral in its message. And I think Christians need to believe that it's unilateral in its message, so they paper over the uncertainty by using words like hermeneutics. I think that's strange. I don't like that because I think it's actually gatekeeping. I never like when people use fancy words when they could use simple ones. Maybe this is just a personal pet peeve, but I always feel like somebody who's good at something can tell you in big technical words what they know about it. Somebody who's really good at something can do the same thing, but in simple words. The best communicators, the ones who can reach out and reach across the aisle and bring people in, are the ones who can simplify the message and reach an audience with it, reach any audience with it. If I'm an expert in a field, but use a lot of big words, all that's doing is keeping people away from the conversation. It's keeping people from entering in. If I were to be an expert in something, I would have to simplify that message so that people who weren't experts could understand it, appreciate it, and join into the fellowship of it. That's really important to me. So when I go into the theological communities and into the influencer communities and all this Christian talking online stuff, and they're using terms like hermeneutics and exegesis and endogesis and all this other stuff, it sounds to me like they're trying to keep people away. I don't want to have to Google a word for how to study the Bible. That's stupid. It's gatekeeping because it's showing that, hey, people like me, the ones who are inside, the ones who know, we use hermeneutics when we read or whatever. I know that's not how they would say it, but you get the point. For a long time, I just didn't look those words up, and I have looked them up more recently, and I understand how they're used, but it's like, how are you supposed to reach people if you've actually complicated the message? You've taken the Bible, which is already mysterious in a lot of ways, and then layered on complicated sounding words so that other people have even more things to climb over to get to an understanding of the Bible like you have. You're gatekeeping around a concept so that people who already agree with you are inside, and the people who don't agree or don't know the words are outside. You've complicated an already complicated message, and I don't think that's cool. I could go on about that for a while, actually. It's a real pet peeve of mine, but maybe you get the point. Adjacent to that is the idea of discernment. I've seen this a lot in the X2x2 community as well, for people leaving meetings and going and joining Christian faiths or Christian churches or whatever, and they talk a lot about discernment, like now they have discernment. And I think that's kind of funny because it just feels like 2x2 to me. It just sounds like you took the word spirit, like good spirit, bad spirit, right spirit, wrong spirit, and just changed some of the words to say discernment. The word discernment is often used to paper over something that's difficult to explain. And once again, if you understand a concept or believe that you have a lot of insight to a concept that's complex, the last thing you want to do is grant yourself a word that means you don't have to explain it to anybody anymore. The evangelical world doesn't really evangelize for this exact reason, because it's hard. It's hard to take concepts and not only help somebody else believe it, but help them understand it more too. There's a cultural component to belief, but not to understanding. That's a different thing. And calling it discernment is papering over the idea that you're going to have to explain it. It's so much easier to say the other person doesn't have discernment or isn't using hermeneutics or whatever than it is to actually connect with the person. I don't like that style of gatekeeping. Even using phrases like, well, I now go to a Bible-based church. Well, the 2x2s are Bible-based also. I think believers should be honest about stuff like that. When they see people who are reading the Bible and coming away with a different message, that doesn't mean they themselves are Bible-based, but the other people aren't. I think if you hold that the Bible is univocal, that's a stepping stone to saying, I'm the only right one and everybody else is wrong. And honestly, that seems like what Christian evangelism is. It's just driving your stake in the ground at one point, saying, I am Bible-based, I have discernment, and nobody else does. And so rather than spreading the message, you just tell everybody else that if they're not like you, they're not right. That's incredibly arrogant. And I don't know. It's funny to think that these people believe that they're going to stand in front of God one day. It's like, are you going to be that honest? Are you going to stand in front of God with that exact thing? Like, hey, I was right this whole time. Didn't you see how right I was? Quick sidebar. I heard a funny joke recently where, let's see if I can reconstitute this joke. So there's 3 people die and go to heaven. One of them is like a Catholic, and another one's some new age guru or something, and the third one's an evangelical pastor. And they go up to heaven, they're at the pearly gates, and they have to do one final interview before they go through the pearly gate. So they have to step into a side room with Jesus. So they're sitting on a little pearly bench next to the pearly gate, and they get called back one at a time. And first the Catholic gets called back, and he goes into the room, and he's in there for 5 minutes, and he comes out and he's like, "What? I thought I was right. This whole time I thought I was right." And he sits down on the bench waiting for a secondary ruling or something. And then the New Age guru gets up and goes into the back room, and the door closes, and he's in there for a while. He's in there for about half an hour. And then the door opens, and he walks out disappointed and sits down and said, "Man, I thought I was right. I really thought I was right. I thought I had it figured out." And then the evangelical pastor gets up, and he gets called back into the back room, and the door closes, and he's in there for like 2 hours. And then pretty soon there's some shouting, and obviously there's a heated conversation going on. So after 2 hours, the door opens, and Jesus walks out the door and says, "I can't believe I was wrong. I thought I had that right." All right. That made me laugh, because that's kind of how I feel about a lot of this stuff. So much of apologetics is based around the fact that the person talking has it right in the first place, and you just need to get on board. I kind of expected less of that, and I don't know why now. In hindsight, I'm not sure why I expected less of it. There's so many lines drawn between the speaker and the listener. Rather than inviting the listener in, they draw a line and tell the listener to jump over it. You hear a lot of, "Are you a Christian or are you just a churchgoer?" You hear that phrase a lot. Like, "Are you this or are you just this? Do you believe in Christ? Do you come to church and listen and believe, or do you just show up on Sundays?" That sounds exactly like professing but not possessing. That sounds exactly like what the workers say. Like, well, do you come to meeting and just give a part, or are you really possessing the love of God? It's the same thing. "I go to a Bible-based church." Yeah, but all churches are Bible-based. It's so funny when I hear people say that they enjoy Bible-based teachings and stuff like that now. It's like, yeah, all churches think they're believing. I think sometimes we forget when our faith transitions that we really did believe before. That's the whole point of this series on my channel. It's deconstructing the idea that I did believe before. It's not that I didn't believe and now I'm rationalizing leaving. I did believe and now I don't. That transition is interesting, and I think people should be more honest about it. And if they do so, they'll realize that when they transition to another belief system that's similar to professing, first of all, that there are similarities. I think it's useful to say that. And I think pretending that there's not, pretending that you left and now you have truth and now you have the right Bible and now you're speaking with discernment, just closes another gate behind you to further conversation. And that doesn't feel evangelical to me. It doesn't feel like you're trying to spread the word. And maybe you're not. Maybe that's the point. Maybe you're not actually speaking to me. Maybe you're not speaking to the seeker. And that's okay. It actually gets one step worse, though, and this really surprised me. Christian apologists insult each other non-stop. A long time ago, I watched a bunch of videos, a bunch of YouTube debates between new atheists, which was, if you're not familiar with the new atheist movement, it was kind of a thing when the internet was really starting to spread out. There was a movement of people calling themselves the new atheists that would go debate Christians a lot in public forums, and the new atheists at the time were people like Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett, Richard Dawkins. A lot of those guys have changed how they view things now in weird ways, but at the time they were just pretty much talking atheist apologetics, essentially. Like, they were apologizing for atheism and lack of belief, and they were debating Christians. And it was really interesting to watch those videos, and I've gone back and watched a bunch of them recently because I realized something struck me vividly while I was watching these the second time, which is that there's two versions of Christian evangelism. There's two argument levels. And this is really obvious, but I wanted to say it anyway to show that I considered it. When Christians were debating the atheists, they were debating as Christians, broadly, in the broadest sense of the term. They were arguing for belief. They were arguing for a belief in a higher power, period. And so the point that they were defending actually wasn't that much more specific than belief. I actually thought that was the most effective that apologetics have been, because they were getting rid of all the gatekeeping and just speaking about the Bible and Jesus and God. Now, I'm not saying I would back any of those guys. Like, if I watched those debates now, I'd probably lean more to the atheist side for sure. But watching Christians argue for belief is very different than watching them argue for Christianity. When Christians are speaking to non-believers, they defend belief. When Christians are speaking to other believers, they defend their own belief, and that's completely different. Christians, when they close the doors and start talking to each other, can't stand each other at all. And that was extremely evident to me while I was watching who I thought were thought leaders in the communities. They constantly call each other heretics. If you just type in any person that you think is a Christian thought leader and then heresy behind their name, you will find tons of videos on YouTube or any sort of streaming platform or whatever of these people condemning other believers for their beliefs. Back in the day with early internet, the conversation seemed to be to believe or not to believe. The conversation now is not that anymore. It's much more finite. It's much more zoomed in on the belief itself. And that turns into parsing each other's beliefs into what's good and what's not. Hermeneutics, discernment, all that stuff is used against each other now rather than non-believers. The internet's so big and the audiences are so large that you don't have to speak to non-believers at all anymore. And that gets back to they're not really evangelizing. They're actually speaking to each other against each other. There are so many videos online or podcasts or whatever with titles like The Dangerous Heresy of ... Heretics believe this ... And it's usually something cultural. I mean, a lot of times they just like to throw around the word heresy when it comes to things like LGBTQ issues or whatever, but there's all kinds of other stuff. There's all kinds of videos telling you that you, the believer, are going to hell because you believe some slightly different thing than the first person or the person making the video. As somebody who is seeking and open to new beliefs and new interpretations of belief, I found this incredibly off-putting. This constant haranguing of each other and calling each other heretics is so strange. And one version of that I've talked about a lot before is saying that if your church believes that the Trinity is a thing, you're correct. If you're not pro-Trinity, if you're a non-Trinitarian church, then you're in a cult. That's incredibly stupid, in my opinion. Sorry if you're watching this and you think that. I'm not trying to insult you personally. I just think that this is not the way. If your belief system is based on parsing out other people, if your belief system is based on pushing other believers away from you, that doesn't seem helpful at all. And a significant amount of apologetic discourse is because of that. It's centered around telling other believers that they don't believe well enough. I'm not bringing this up just because it's off-putting. I mean, I am. It's extremely off-putting to watch Christians call each other heretics and cult members, rather than try to gather everyone into the church, the broader church, into the body of Christ, as it were. Telling everybody else they don't deserve to be in the body of Christ is just so gatekeepy and weird. But it's not just that. It's not just that it's off-putting and strange. It's that they actually are arguing two sides of a logical point. It's that they're actually arguing two mutually exclusive and contradictory things, in my opinion. Back when I used to watch Christian versus atheist debates on YouTube, a common line of reasoning from the Christian side was essentially what some people call Pascal's wager. The idea being that if you don't know whether Christianity is true, or if there is a heaven, or if there's an afterlife, or if heaven and hell are real things, you should bet on the side of that is true. You should bet that that's true because if you're wrong, there's no downside, but if you're right, there's benefit. Whereas an atheist, if they believe that there isn't something and so they don't live for an afterlife, but there is one, the penalty is really extreme. That's a decent line of reasoning for a lot of Christians, and that worked for me for a long time too. In fact, I probably have argued that with somebody, or at least brought it up, talked about it. But that falls apart the second you get into a Christian community where they're talking to each other, because they don't use that same logic for each other. If you believe that logic, you would want everyone to believe as close to you as possible, with an understanding that you might get it wrong. If you're worried that getting it wrong could lead to eternal consequences, you should be aware of where you might actually have it wrong yourself, I would think. And if there's another Christian out there who has a different reading of the Bible, it seems like you'd want to really listen to them, rather than say you have discernment and they don't. So when Christians are arguing with atheists, they have this idea that they just need to bet on the idea that God exists and that heaven exists and all this, because if they're wrong, it doesn't matter. But once you get into the Christian communities, they constantly chop away at each other's beliefs, calling each other heretics and saying that they don't have the right hermeneutics and stuff, reading the Bible, and completely lose the perspective that they had in the first place that got them there. If they believe in that Pascal's wager, then they should invite everybody into the broader Christian community in general. When they're arguing atheists, they're just arguing for a belief in God. But when they're arguing with other Christians, they're arguing very small, finite details and acting if those are important, or those are as important as belief in God itself. I don't really track that. I don't understand it. And every time I hear somebody say that non-Trinity equals cult, that's what I'm hearing is you don't believe in Pascal's wager anymore. Pascal's wager gives credit to believers broadly. And that's why my perception is that they're getting rid of it as soon as they get into a Christian community and start talking to each other. Because your broad belief in God doesn't count when you're talking to other believers. Yet another form of gatekeeping. Okay, I'm going to let that go. But it's significant to me. It was significant in my deconstruction. Speaking of words and gatekeeping with words, another thing that kind of bugged me, I guess this will be the last one on this section, I think, about gatekeeping. I could go on for a while because it's the most significant to me, but I'm trying to keep these episodes short. I don't know. These episodes are all getting really long. I'll try to do some short ones. If you've made it this far into this one, here's an Easter egg. I'm going to make some short ones. I don't know what they're going to be on. Send me comments. Comment something you want a short episode on. Okay, so speaking of words and gatekeeping, I was blown away at how much of theology, or maybe just apologetics, how much of their terminology is post-biblical. And when I say post-biblical, that's hard to define that exactly because Bible is what? Bible could exist anytime, right? It's a bunch of books. So how the books looked 2,000 years ago as opposed to now is completely different, although it's not that old, I guess. Some of it is. When I say post-biblical, I'm not sure what that means because, the Bible's changing a lot. If you listen to my Bible episode, you'll realize that the Bible isn't really a thing and biblical is in the eye of the beholder. But to that point, a lot of apologists use words that have nothing to do with the Bible to justify their own belief and specific particular theology. I was blown away how often I would hear words like dispensationalism and complementarianism, to throw that in with words like hermeneutics and exegesis. It's just a bunch of academic nonsense. And I understand it's not nonsense to them. It has meaning to them and it has spiritual weight for them. They feel like it's really important. The words do mean something. They're real. I Googled a lot of them and I watched videos on them to understand what they were saying. They're just adding big, long words to concepts to make them sound authoritative. Using big words sounds authoritative to a lot of people. It doesn't to me, but it does to some people, especially the people using those words. To me, it sounds like you're hand-waving your way past the idea that you're actually talking about a fairly simple concept and trying to make it sound more complex. Like I mentioned before, people who really know what they're talking about can take a complex idea and give it a simple word. People who are just trying to sound authoritative will take a simple concept and put a really long word in front of it to make it look like they own it and to make it look like they're the expert. I understand things like the pre-trib and post-trib type conversations are theological and can happen, but those are kind of gatekeepy as well. But when you're talking complementarianism and dispensationalism, that's not real. That's not in the Bible. I actually have a section later called Making Stuff Up. I'll come back to some of this. There's actually more to this one. Yeah, okay, I'm just going to cut this one off right here. I'm going to move on to my next section because I feel like a lot of these sections actually blur together too much. So I'm going to move to a different topic of things that annoy me about all this stuff called stagecraft. A lot of what I'm going to say under the stagecraft heading could have been said about the gatekeeping heading as well, but that's okay. I'm going to still talk about it because I feel like it's a slightly different thing, and I'll explain why. I'm using the term stagecraft to describe how I view the presentation of apologetics and the presentation of theological discussions. I've already talked about gatekeeping, but that has more to do with the intent to keep people away from their beliefs as a validation for their own beliefs. This is more about the methods of doing that and how it looks to an outsider, which is what I am. I realized this partway through that I was an outsider and it felt really weird, but it gave me a lot of freedom to critique what they were doing because if they wanted to save my soul, they were going to have to reach out to me in some way. Obviously, they can't see me through the YouTube screen, as far as I know. But I assume that I am something like a seeker, that I was seeking something. I was a soul that was looking for a home or whatever, a spiritual home. I was looking for some clarity in my own beliefs, and being pushed away via gatekeeping was one thing. And when I realized I had been pushed away in that sense, at least that's how I felt, that's how I interpreted what they were doing and how they were talking, I was able to see things like the stagecraft of how they were talking, how they were presenting themselves. I think a lot of apologists aren't aware of how they come across to people because they're speaking to such a captive audience. They're speaking not to the outer world, to seekers like myself. They're just speaking to each other, making themselves feel better. And as such, they're not as clean on their methodologies. And their stagecraft in it, that's the word I use for it, their stagecraft is easy to see through in some ways. The first thing is back to language. I noticed how often they would say things like, we know, and it's not debatable, and true this, true that, true Christianity, true discernment, all that stuff. Those types of words around, I'm correct because I own this term, is everything I disliked about the 2x2s. I've talked about this before, but when we were in meetings, my youngest kid, when my kid was maybe, 3-4 years old, something like that, really young, actually maybe even younger, early talking days, early talking and walking, my kid would mimic the workers, would watch a gospel meeting, be intrigued by it, actually really loved one of our older sister workers, and would mimic her at home. And so my kid would sit there holding a book and then would stand up and start mimicking what they'd seen in meeting. And the way they mimicked this older sister worker was saying, we know, blah, 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 blah. We know, blah, blah, blah. Because to them, that's how the worker sounded. The professing version of me thought that was really interesting, that my kids' takeaway from meeting was that the workers thought they knew everything. They didn't have to necessarily defend it. We know it. We don't need to interrogate these ideas. We know them. Not only I know them, but we know them. Those of you who agree with me on this know them. And I saw that so much in the Christian apologetic world too. It's not debatable. We don't need to debate this. It's not a debate. We're not here to have a conversation. We know. We already know. Maybe the Spirit led us, maybe God spoke to us, or it's just in the Bible. I've heard so many people in the Christian community say the plain reading of the Bible text, and then follow that up with something that isn't in the Bible at all. I mean, not there at all. They just make it up. Okay, sorry, that's the next section. I have a making stuff up section next. I'll get to that. But the first bit of stagecraft is just confidence. It's just showing that we know this. Very used car salesman. In the United States, we have a lot of euphemisms for people who talk like this. We call them like car salesmen or vacuum salesmen, door-to-door salesmen. It's this methodology of speaking where it's like you really try to sell something using some sort of built-in authority that you just claim to have. Another thing that I saw often that reminded me of 2x2s was emotion, a lot of showing emotion. I thought this was really interesting too because I kind of didn't expect to see it. I think this surprised me more than any of the things I saw in apologetics was using apologetics with a lot of emotion, like, oh, just God just loves you so much. And oh, we're sinners, aren't we? We just feel sad about that. We feel terrible, but God loves us so much. We can't hardly even understand it, or we can't hardly describe it. And they get into this breathy way of talking. And I'm like, man, I left meetings because that annoyed me. Okay, that's not why I left meetings, but you know what I mean? When I look back at meetings, one of the things that I sort of crack up about is just how much emotion, just this fake emotion was there. I did a whole episode on emotion toward the beginning of my channel. You could go back and find it. I think it's called Reclaiming Emotion. Redefinition, Reclaiming Emotion. That was something that surprised me. I didn't realize how much performative emotion there would be in churches and in just theological speeches, in sermons, and in convention speeches given to pastors by pastors. You don't have to do that. They all believe it, and yet they still did that. It still sold the idea in their minds. It sold the idea of their belief that it made them emotional. I'm not even really saying that's wrong necessarily, because I think a lot of people do feel those emotions. So I'm not critiquing it in the sense of like, they're dumb, they use emotion. That's not actually what I'm saying. I'm just saying it's not that different than we were when we were professing. I had emotions. Everyone has probably cried in a testimony at some point. I did. I didn't do it a lot. I wasn't super emotional with my testimonies, but sometimes I did. Sometimes I really felt it that way. Some of us cried every single time. Some of it's social anxiety. Some of it's just a real connection to our belief. And when your belief changes, it's weird to look back on that, but it still happened. That's how I felt at the time. And so when I see other people feel that way now, I also have to project onto this situation the fact that I don't feel that way anymore. And so when I watch somebody talk this way, I feel like I'm looking backwards, not looking forwards. I feel like I'm looking at an old version of me that I no longer think is real, or I no longer believe is true. And so when I see other apologists doing the same thing while they're trying to describe their belief, it discredits it a tiny bit in my mind. Again, not to say that they are not credible. I don't mean it that way. I just mean that the belief is to them like my belief used to be to me, and it no longer is. So I don't connect with it. That's all I'm going to say. Another tactic of stagecraft I saw was, I don't have a good term for it. I'm going to call it a gish gallop, but that's not exactly what it is. A gish gallop, a lot of times when you're watching political debates, you'll see people just talk and throw a whole bunch of topics out at one time and not give you a chance to respond to them, and then claim that they won because you can't argue them down, because they can say something crazy really quickly, but if it takes you a long time to refute them, then they think they've won. Crazy stuff's easy to say really quickly. Truthful stuff, well thought out stuff, reasonable stuff takes longer to put together. But sometimes that works. Sometimes just saying a bunch of stuff really fast works. And I've seen a lot of apologists, when they're talking, especially when they have other people involved in the conversation, just speed through a bunch of points. And the reason they get away with it is because nobody really pushes back, because, again, nobody wants to be called a heretic. So even when apologists are talking to each other, they'll speed through points that are not defendable at all, in my opinion, but they don't have to defend them. So the fact that they sped through them implies that you should know them as well. There's a very popular YouTube apologist who does a lot of reaction videos, does a few debates, does a lot of theological statements, just does a lot of like cultural commentary and stuff like that. He's reaching out. He's evangelizing in his own way. He's very popular. He's been reposted in my group before. He gets reposted in the Christian group quite a bit. I noticed this thing I'm talking about with him. He would do this thing even in sermons at his own church, when he's speaking in front of his own church. He'll do this thing where he's talking, and then he'll say a bunch of stuff really quickly, offhandedly, as if they're basic assumptions that he just had to touch on for context but didn't need to explain. But the things he's saying are controversial. I'm not going to get into the details of what they are. I just think that it's notable. I think it's interesting to see people gather to themselves credibility via acting like they know what they're talking about, and acting like not only do they know, but if you're with them, you should know them too. It's the gatekeeping thing, combined with the stagecraft of just talking really quickly and moving right through it. I mentioned used car salesman. It's kind of a derogatory phrase here in the United States, which is too bad because there's nothing wrong with selling cars for a living, but it's a common tactic when someone's selling you something too, to just speak really fast so you don't quite have time to react or process what they're saying. I think it's actually fairly dishonest, but I get it. I get that it works. The problem is it's not great apologetics. When you're having apologetic discourse and you're not defining what you're talking about and you're speeding through it, it just implies to the audience that there's something wrong with them if they don't get it. Well, as an outside seeker, as somebody who's watching who doesn't believe all this stuff necessarily, but is willing to listen, I don't want to have to go Google everything you talked about. I was looking for more clarity, and after I watched some of these people, I ended up with less. The last thing I wanted to talk about with stagecraft is a sleight of hand trick that a lot of people play when they're talking about cultural issues. I've been talking mostly about how apologists talk to each other or within their own communities and, calling each other heretics and shaming each other for their hermeneutics and whatever. They do talk to other people too, though. Every once in a while, you'll see an apologetic person, like an apologist or someone with a podcast, somebody who's social media aware, go on to a TV show and do a little, 2 or 3 minute thing where they talk about some cultural issue. Politics and religion are way too intertwined right now, and that's part of what's pushed me away from religion. To be completely honest, I talk about that a little bit in my last episode about moment of clarity. Part of my moment of clarity is seeing that religion is almost downstream of politics at this point, and I think it's disgusting and unconscionable, frankly. But that's my opinion. It just shows that there's no room for me in the Christian community. But one of the things I've noticed when a social media savvy Christian apologist goes into a public space where they're talking to people that may not believe the same as them or even arguing a case, they do this subtle little sleight of hand on certain cultural issues. When the person on the other side points out that, hey, the belief that you're arguing for is just your belief. It's just from the Bible, I guess. Or it's just yours, but it shouldn't be everybody else's. You need to keep that to yourself. The Christian will pull a subtle little sleight of hand move and stop talking about the Bible. I've noticed this a lot in public debates about abortion, LGBTQ issues, things like that. Things having to do with people's rights in a natural sense, but clouded heavily by religion. The religious people will stop arguing the Bible because the Bible doesn't actually work for what they're saying, and I think there's some acknowledgement there that it doesn't. I noticed recently there was a conversation on a TV show between a Bible scholar and a theologian apologist type person. And a topic came up, and the Bible scholar said, hey, the Bible says this. It contradicts your point, Christian. And the Christian did a quick sleight of hand move, pulled the rabbit out of the hat, and said, science agrees with me. Science says this. This is better via science. This is better for culture. It's better for our natural world because even science agrees with me on that. The sleight of hand here being, A, the Bible doesn't answer the question they thought it did. Even though they came on to argue that the Christian worldview is better and should be used, they couldn't. So they quickly shifted to a scientific conversation. But as soon as the counterpoint was, well, the science is up for debate on that, and a lot of people view the science differently, well, then they switch right back to religion. Well, but religion, something, something, something. It's just an interesting conversation to listen to when the Bible doesn't actually answer the questions we think it should, and we can try to do it. We can call it hermeneutics, and we can read with discernment and make it say certain things. But when we run out of an ability to do that, sometimes Christians will switch over into, well, actually, science is saying this, this, and this. And that implies that science is more useful. And I think that if we're having scientific debates, we should talk via a lens of science, natural sciences, culture even. If we're having religious debates, we should talk about those. So that's just something I noted. I think it's a funny little sleight of hand that people play, and I don't think it's honest. I think it's really disingenuous. I do think it's okay to switch back and forth, but acknowledge when you're doing it that it's because the Bible doesn't cover what you're saying. So if the Christian worldview picks parts of science, that's okay, but I think that should be notated. If a young earth creationist says that they don't believe in abortion because of science, I think they need to spell out those differences. If a Christian believes something about some social issue or abortion or LGBTQ issues and claims that it's because of science, I don't think they can also say that their Christian worldview is superior if they're a young earth creationist. I don't think you can do both things. I think it's subtle and clever, but I don't honor it as good apologetics. If your apologetics end and you have to switch over to some other tool, that's fine. Just acknowledge that that's what's happening and acknowledge that you're stepping out of the Christian world. The Christian world and the biblical world give you a certain answer, and when you run out of those answers, just admit that those answers aren't there. That's what I've done, and that's what actually got me into Bible scholarship. That's what I realized that the Bible wasn't answering the questions I thought it was, and the theologians and the apologists, they weren't answering it either. They weren't doing the same thing. So they were using a lot of pressure and a lot of gatekeeping, but they weren't answering the questions. And they were kind of saying, if you have discernment, you'll just get this. Well, discernment is a way to not have to actually defend it. I can't validate anybody else's discernment. If they tell me they have it, that's fine, but it doesn't mean anything to me. So it's not a good apologetic. It's not useful for apologetics. All right, I think that's enough for that subtopic. The stagecraft, sleight of hand, that kind of stuff. That actually feels really dishonest to me. And so I started with gatekeeping. That was a little bit off-putting. So I took a step back and realized how much sleight of hand was going on. It does get one step worse. My opinion gets one step worse. And that's why I called my last category, just making stuff up. I understand that each of these topics sounds like they're getting more and more insulting to evangelical Christianity apologetics, and I don't mean to insult them. I feel like this is constructive criticism. I hope it can be taken that way. But this last one's going to be the hardest to make it sound like that. This last topic is going to be the hardest one to wedge into positive feedback. I felt like a lot of what apologists use to defend their faith is just made up. It's not in the Bible. It's not anywhere. It's cultural stuff. It's gatekeeping around ideas that aren't even verifiable. The average person couldn't pick up a Bible, read it, and come up with what an apologist was saying. The first thing that made me think of this as a topic happened early on when I was listening to apologetics. There's a very famous preacher. He actually passed away this year. So maybe you'll know who I'm talking about. A couple of them did. A couple famous preachers passed away this year. It was one of them. I was listening to one of his videos. I was actually just flipping through reels on YouTube and listening to the tone and listening to how they were talking. And this pastor was mocking the idea that a lot of non-believers bring, which is, if you believe the Bible, why don't you believe the whole Bible? If you say that somewhere in Leviticus it tells you people can't be gay or something, then what about eating shrimp, wearing mixed fabrics, things like that? If you believe the whole Bible, why aren't you sacrificing turtle doves when you sin? And his response to that kind of blew my mind. In the 2x2s, we always believed that when Jesus came, it fulfilled the old law, and we didn't need to pay attention to the old law anymore, except for when it was convenient. If the old law said no trees in your house, we can no longer celebrate Christmas. Stuff like that. If the old law said anything involving sexuality, we weren't going to stone anybody like the old law said, but we will feel bad about it, and we will make everyone else feel bad about it too. It's really important. It's really important to make people that disagree with you feel bad. That's prevalent in 2x2 culture, and it's prevalent in the Christian community as well. So when this fairly famous pastor with pretty big reach was faced with this question, he said something really interesting that I've seen mimicked a lot of other places. And maybe he wasn't the first one to say it. Maybe a lot of people have talked this way. But he said there's a difference between the moral law and the ceremonial law in the Old Testament. That some of those laws were there because that's how we should be. And some of those laws were there because that's how we should sacrifice. But we don't have to sacrifice that way anymore because Jesus came and was a sacrifice. So we don't need to go sacrifice a turtle dove as a burnt offering or whatever bird it was. Partridge in a pear tree, perhaps. We don't have to do that anymore because Jesus was the sacrifice, but we're still accountable to the moral law. And he justified that by the same way 2x2s justify their own faith, which is, the whole Bible is good for law, good for teaching, good for instruction, stuff like that. Whatever that verse, I think Peter wrote a verse like that, like, hey, the whole book is good for this. But that stopped me in my tracks because moral law versus ceremonial law is made up. There's no way, as I understand the Bible, as I understand people, as I understand writing, there's no way that the God of creation could tell them what to do and they would view some of it as moral law, some of it as ceremonial law. I'd always viewed the Bible as somewhat of a historical document, but implied in that is that the people reading it at the time had their particular viewpoint on it. My viewpoint now could see it differently. Maybe my viewpoint now as a Christian would be that it's all good for teaching, it's all good for reproach or whatever, that whole verse from Peter or Paul or whoever it was that I referenced in the Bible episode. So my perspective on the Bible now can be whatever it is, but the perspective of the people at the time was whatever it was to them. People don't view laws that way. And if God of heaven comes down and speaks to you, you're not going to parse those into different categories. Now, maybe the correct hermeneutics or whatever is to parse those up yourself, but that's not implied in the Bible, in my opinion. The idea that you could split up the Bible into laws that I want to follow and laws that I don't, based on subheadings that you put there yourself, that just makes you God or something. I don't know. It seems really narcissistic to me, to be completely honest with you. It was very off-putting for me to hear that the Bible was split up into sections based on our current interpretation as far as what we think we should follow and what we think we shouldn't. If you're going to say that you have truth and you have the whole Bible and you have all the discernment, blah, 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 it's weird to use it that way. It's weird to make up categories for scripture that was written in another language thousands of years ago, potentially, and claim that it's obvious to you that certain things are one way and certain things are another way in a way that you can actually bifurcate all of the text. This is part of what got me into listening to Bible scholars, because I was like, there's no way that somebody who's only read their Bible and hasn't done any research on, say, the linguistics or the cultural significance or whatever, there's no way somebody who hasn't done that work can make a claim like these are moral laws versus these are ceremonial laws. That's just so wild to me. I couldn't quite understand that, but it is what it is. I mean, that's their belief, and that's fine. They're entitled to it, but it's not reaching me. It's not reaching me, the seeker, the one who's looking for better clarity on the Bible. To have that kind of clarity just be made up. Made up assertions aren't clarity. That's just your opinion. So that's the first thing I noted as things being made up. And eventually I had taken such a big step back from apologetics and Christian thought that I was noticing this type of thing often. I've mentioned before specific examples like the whole eye of the needle equals a gate in the wall thing, that Jesus was referring to a camel needing to get on its knees and go through a gate. That's not real, of course, but a lot of people believe that. And I saw that in the evangelical world too. I see some people who don't think that. I guess those people have more discernment or whatever, but a lot of people do believe it. And I think that's funny because it's clearly just made up. But that's a very specific example. I don't have any other specific examples I want to talk about necessarily. There are other specific examples too, and a lot of them center around cultural things currently, current culture / politics, things like abortion, things like LGBTQ stuff. Most of those assertions are entirely made up, entirely. And I could do it too, and I could make up assertions that say the exact opposite thing, but maybe I don't have the discernment. I'm not in their church, so what I say doesn't matter as much. And that's fine. I'm not going to be in their church for reasons just like that. One of the things I thought was interesting is how often people can really describe hell as a way of scaring parishioners. Detailed descriptions of hell in ways that they can't quite detail heaven. Not too many Christians can give you a great description of heaven. And I understand not wanting to blaspheme and do so or whatever. You don't want to say something out of school based on assertions about the Almighty. But for some reason, they're fine talking about just how terrible hell will be. I think that's interesting because that's not really in the Bible either. There are some vague allusions to punishment, but I don't know. I think it's funny to hear all the detailed descriptions of hell. A lot of the making stuff up just comes from any assertion packaged as discernment, because you have to package it that way if it's not in the Bible. It has to be spirit-led, meaning a lot of times made up. And if that sounds blasphemous of me to say, I'm going to point out the fact that so many people who are led by the Spirit hate other people who are led by the Spirit. They both call each other heretics. They both don't like each other. I really thought there would be more cohesion in the Christian community when I left meetings. I really thought that they would try to reach out to each other. And you hear people talk about the body of Christ, like the Christian church broadly is the body of Christ, but they tend to discern each other away. I guess I'm back to my first topic of gatekeeping. I'll let that one go because I talked about it too much already. The last thing I'm going to mention in this section, I could go on for a while, but it would be a bit gratuitous at this point. This episode's long enough. But the last thing I'll mention is just that a lot of Christian preaching that I watched was based entirely on things like marginal notes, versification, the way chapters break down, and definitions of words and definitions of terms and description of culture. A lot of things that are extra biblical, not what's in the text. Like I mentioned before, I think I mentioned earlier in this episode that a lot of people say, well, just a plain reading of the text is how I get my belief. Well, that's what we said in the 2x2s also. We said we didn't need a theology or a doctrine or anything because we just had the Bible. We just read the Bible. And then we wore buns and skirts. This idea that you just plainly read the Bible and get a completely different reading as the person next to you creates a situation where one of you needs to blame the other one for not having discernment. And that's not a critique of either of you. It's a critique of how you read the Bible. It's a critique of how univocal the Bible is. It really isn't. And I think that rather than beat that to death, I would just say go listen to my episode on the Bible. I notice how often really well-respected Bible teachers, they like to say Bible teacher even above pastor and stuff like that. Well-renowned Bible teachers would talk about their sermons via things like, you'll notice in your Bible there's a note at the top that says this, or there's a marginal note that says this. This helps explain this, this, and this. Well, that's by definition not in the Bible. Now, of course, we did that as 2x2s as well. We would say, hey, in my margin it says this, or there's a cross-link to this verse. That's fine. I'm not even critiquing that it's happening. But all those things are made up in the sense that they're later innovations on the Bible. The Bible itself is a later innovation on other Bibles. But no matter what Bible you pick up. But the marginal notes and the explainer text and things like that are extra biblical. And that's fine, but those are one person's discernment. Another person might not have the same discernment, and calling each other names doesn't really work. Okay, again, I've kind of beat that whole thing to death, so I'll stop there. It probably just sounds like I'm trashing belief and Christian apologetics and stuff, and I'm not doing that. I don't mean to do that, I should say. I'm not trying to diminish the faith of believers, but I'm just pointing out that there's some things that don't jive for me, and that's why I've taken off the Christian label. I don't call myself a Christian anymore because so much of this stuff is baked in. I always felt like I could believe in different ways. I could believe the real pragmatic world as measured by science, as observed, as seen and felt tactily. And that was one way of belief. That was one way of interpreting God's creation. But then there's the spiritual side, the meaning-making side, the point of life side of belief. And that's what I was trying to explore when I got into Christian apologetics, because that's what I thought I was going to get. I thought when I listened to apologists, I would get more of the meaning-making that wasn't necessarily pragmatic and science-y, but it spoke to spiritual things and interpreted the Bible in a way that brought us into more fellowship with other believers, things like that. And what I found is the opposite. I didn't find that. I found a lot of name-calling, gatekeeping, and having terrible opinions, and then defending them with sleight of hand, and sometimes just making things up and pretending that that's pragmatic, pretending that that's what matters, pretending that if you believe at all, you have to be on the same side of these imaginary lines as themselves. And I just didn't jive with that. I don't like it. But that's not to say that it can't be done. That's just my experience. I think we do need both. Like I said, there's gaps in our knowledge, and there's gaps in anybody's understanding of the world. Our brains aren't made to understand absolutely everything all the time and be right all the time. It's impossible. So the way we make meaning in those gaps in our knowledge or understanding can be a lot of different things. Belief is one of those things, and that's okay. I don't mind that at all. But it feels less and less valuable to me to use Christianity in that space. I don't know what's in that space at the moment. I'm not sure what size of space that is. It's definitely there, but I don't find the meaning making in Christian apologetics to be worth my time anymore. Like I say, though, I do understand that it does provide meaning for a lot of people, and I don't say that that's wrong. I just don't understand it. I don't feel it, but I get it on some level. But I think it's worth noting that that meaning isn't inherent and it's not universal. And I think that Christian apologetics tries to make it universal. I think Christian apologetics try to say that their beliefs are inherent and indisputable and therefore can be universal. And I don't think that's true. And I think it does a disservice to their own belief system because it holds people like me at arm's length. The point of this episode isn't to drag apologetics, although that is kind of what I did. The point is just to point out that apologetics are vibes-based. They're not fact-based at all. And that's fine. They're good for that. They are good for giving us comfort and peace and even joy and fellowship in places that can't necessarily be described or mathematically determined, projected. At the moment, apologetics are not my jam because they don't add any insight for me. They don't add insight into the broader world. And I think that is what I'm looking for on some level. Not in the sense that I'm shopping around. I just think that that's what I naturally do. I naturally look for insight. I think we all do, and we all find it in different ways, and this just isn't my way anymore. Maybe someday I'll circle back, but I don't know. I don't know if I will or not. One quick note about all of this is that I'm not saying that I'm looking for something more logical. Meaning making isn't necessarily logical. And I think it makes a mistake when people try to make meaning of something that isn't scientific and rational, blah, blah, blah. It would be a mistake to say that that's not logical. It is logic. There is logic to it. There is rationale to it. You can develop ideas around non-tactile things with logic and rationale, but understand that that just doesn't make them universal. They're not universal. They're not inherent. And that's okay. I'll admit that right now my BS sensor might be cranked really high, maybe too high. Because I grew up in a belief system, I believed it, I defended it, and I started to raise a family in it, even though I now think it was BS. I used to look like one of those people, and I look back a little bit in horror at some of that. I used to look like this sort of, traditional Christian whatever, and my family maybe to some people still looks like that, although it's less like that every day, but we did look like that for a long time, whether we believed or not. It didn't really matter. That's just who we were, and on some level who we are. But I know that a lot of what went into it and made me who I was is nonsensical belief. And my radar for that right now might be a little oversensitive. My BS sensor might be cranked a little too high right now. That might be true, and that's okay for now. That's just who I am, and that's how I feel at the moment. I do look for clarity in life, and there's a couple different ways you can look for clarity. I've had this thought on a couple episodes, and I haven't really had a place to wedge it in, so I'm just going to stuff it in right here. There's two different ways of seeking clarity. You can zoom in or you can zoom out. A lot of people, when they leave the 2x2s, find another church that has the exact right theology, and they zoom in and get really into those details, and they don't really look at the broader world anymore, and that's fine. That's what they do. That's who they are. That doesn't work for me, though, and it doesn't work for my wife, and it doesn't work for our family. We get clarity by zooming out, by looking at the bigger picture, understanding where everything sits in relation to each other. Less detail? Maybe. More perspective? Yes. Zoom in, you get detail. Zoom out, you get perspective. And that's all personality based, I think. I think people just do what they do. They look for clarity the way they're comfortable getting clarity. And I'm not going to say one's right or wrong, but I will say that mine comes from the latter. It comes from zooming out and getting perspective. That's where I feel comfortable. Right or wrong, I'm not trying to say that I'm more right or more logical or more rational. I'm definitely not, but I'm more comfortable here. Both of the zoom in and zoom out methods are just trying to simplify perspective. Sometimes simplification is just to get rid of extraneous things and look at small details. And sometimes simplification means to zoom out and look at all of it together, where the small details are swallowed up in the overall picture. One final note in this episode, and that is to take one quick look again at proselytizing and apologetics as a mechanism of convincing people of things. Like I say, the 2x2s don't spread their gospel. They try to just be a really good example by wearing their hair a certain way so people will know what truth is. But I was looking into the apologetic world to see what it looks like when people actually try to convince people of their beliefs. And I've talked about all of that so far and my impressions of it. But I wanted to add just a quick section here at the end for people who are listening who maybe still believe, are believers, and would like to convince others, would like to talk to others about their belief, and maybe want to reach out of their communities. A lot of what I've talked about in this episode is how the community talks within itself. But a couple notes on what it looks like when Christians speak from their perspective out to others, try to pull others in, try to draw people like me in. There's some considerations that I think a lot of Christian apologists don't make that they should, that would help their case a lot. First of all, it's helpful to remember that people who left religion left it for a reason. That reason is not what a lot of apologists think, a lot of 2x2s. I did a whole episode at the very beginning of this channel where I talked about how people had completely wrong ideas about why people leave meeting. Oh, they just leave to go sin. They just leave to go do their own thing. They left because they're bitter. That's dismissive and stupid and wrong. And I think it would be useful to understand why people leave and to speak to that a little bit. If you're interested in apologetics and interested in speaking to people who don't believe like yourself, it would be useful to understand that it's not because they haven't heard your version of truth yet. They might have already heard it, but it was difficult. There's something happened with your set of beliefs that pushed them away, and you might have to overcome that to pull them back in. That reason might be something listed here. People leave religion when it's untenable for some reason. And so when you come to them and tell them they're wrong for doing it, that doesn't matter to them. It doesn't click with them at all. Christianity kind of lacks this self-awareness. This is kind of point 2 in this section. Christianity lacks the self-awareness of we might be the problem, other people aren't Christians. As Christianity declines, although I've heard it might be upticking a little bit in American culture, I'm not sure. I don't know any numbers on that. But over time, less and less people believe. And a lot of apologetics is based around the fact that those people are bad. If that's what you believe, fine, but that's not going to convince anybody. It may make you feel good, but it doesn't make the case you think it does that you have truth. And by the way, 2x2s are not the only ones who think they have truth, capital T, trademark, registered. A lot of Christians say they have truth. It's very, very common. Christianity should have the self-awareness that it is the problem a lot of times. And if the only tool you have is to say that people who don't believe like you are bad and they're heretics and don't have discernment, that's not helping you. That's not doing anything. And if that's what you truly believe, and you truly believe that you can take that story with you and go stand in front of the eternal God, I guess that's up to you. That seems weird to me. It seems very not self-aware. Seems a bit narcissistic, but that's you. You do you. I won't be part of that. But if you want to bring people like me in, you should consider the fact that people left Christianity because of Christianity most of the time. People leave meetings because of meetings. People left the 2x2s because of the 2x2s, not because of some external thing, not because they were evil or they wanted to go sin. Most of the time they left against their own will because they were pushed out. And Christianity is the same way. For the same reason nobody listens to workers, a lot of people don't listen to apologists either. It's the same thing. The beliefs might be slightly different, but the methods are exactly the same when you strip away a lot of the excess, a lot of the pomp and circumstance around it. Belief systems are for morals. And I'm not going to dig into this point, but I think if you've listened to my channel for very long and you realize how often I'm mostly talking about culture, this is why. A lot of people leave Christianity and a lot of people leave the 2x2s because of culture, and that shows up as morals. If somebody tells me they have discernment, but they look like they lack morals to me, then I'm not going to follow them. I don't care what words they use. I don't care if they call me a heretic. I don't care if they use exegesis or whatever. If they don't look like they're morally better people because of their beliefs, then I'm going to charge that to their beliefs. And I think a lot of times Christians say, well, they're not real Christians. Those ones over there, they just go to church. They're just churchgoers. They're not church believers. They're not Christ believers. Well, whatever. Gatekeep all you want. But at the end of the day, you're all believers. And believers need to police each other. Not in the sense of telling each other they're not believers, in the sense of making sure that they're better moral people. The 2x2s couldn't do that. The 2x2s were so right that they didn't bother to be good. And I see that a lot in the broader Christian community as well. A lot of gatekeeping is done around identity, but not enough gatekeeping is done around morals and morality. Instead, bad morals are justified with words, with gatekeeping. All right, I feel like I'm talking in circles and I've talked a lot, and I'm sorry this episode's really long again. I'll do some short ones. Maybe. But I wanted to get this all out. I felt like I've talked about apologetics a lot in different places, but I've left a lot on the table, and I feel better now because I've kind of got it all out and recorded. Who knows, maybe someday I'll change my view about religion and belief and the apologetics around it and theology and things like that. But right now, I'm very put off by them. I'm not put off by believers, by the way. If you're a believer, I think we can coexist just fine in any room. But I'm glad I don't have to apologize for your beliefs. I'm glad that I don't have to do that. I'm really happy that I have the freedom to step away from all of that and look on from the outside. And maybe I'll come back someday. I don't know. I don't feel like I will. Because I feel like this might be a pattern. For now, I'm just happy that I don't have to apologize for any of it.